Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Rowe. We're looking at Algebra 2A. This is Lesson 10. We're talking about completing the square. So now for completing the square, we have to have the quadratic equation in the form x squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And then we're going to work on it from there. But the key point here is that the leading coefficient must be 1. If it's anything else, we've got to do something. And we'll look at the rest of the process in just a minute. So let's get started looking at this. So here is where we're going. We want to get to a place where we have an equation like this that we can solve. So at this point, all we've got to do is, since we have a perfect square binomial, then we're going to take a square root, which will leave us x minus 4, equals, now here's the key point of the lesson. On the other side, when you take the square root of 9, there are two possible square roots we're going to take. And that's because we're dealing with an equation. And then we're going to solve for x. So if we add 4 to each side, we're going to get x equals 4 plus or minus 3. So we got two different answers. X is going to equal either 4 plus 3, or x is going to equal 4 minus 3. So x here is going to equal either 7 or x will equal 1. So that's where we're going. Now, the ones that we're going to do probably won't be so simple. We're going to have some that are quadratic, or simplified radicals is what I meant to say. And so you're going to have to pay attention to that as well. So let's take a look at what we got to do. So here's our first example here. So we've got an equation. The coefficient is 1. So how do we complete the square? To complete the square, we're going to take half of b. All right, so b in this particular problem is 14. So we're going to take half of 14. And we're going to square it and add it to each side. So plus 7 squared plus 7 squared. So that's the completing the square process. So remember, the reason we added it to both sides is because whatever you do to one side, you also do to the other. So why did we do that? Well, on the left, that gives us that perfect square binomial. And that's because we're using the fact that when you multiply a perfect square binomial, when you FOIL, this is the end result every time. So we're kind of working backwards here a little bit. And on the other side, we've got negative 12 plus 49. So negative 12 plus 49, so this gives me x plus 7 squared equals, and then negative 12 plus 49 is 37. And now we're just going to do what we did in the last example. We're going to take the square root of each side, and remember over here, we're going to leave the radical as a radical if it's not a perfect square root. We'll simplify it if we can, but otherwise we're just going to leave it. So this will be plus or minus the square root of 37. And so now we're just going to solve for x. Subtract 7, and then x is going to equal negative 7 plus or minus the square root of 37. So that's the process, folks. Half of b. Then we're going to square it and add that to both sides. And then we're going to set up our perfect square binomial and then solve for x after taking the square root. All right, let's take a look at this example. So what do we do in this case? We've got all the terms on one side. Before I can complete the square, I've got to have just ax plus b isolated. So we need to isolate. I can't type that out, so I'm going to write ax squared. And actually, we're going to change that to x squared plus bx. So over here, we have to add 77 to each side. Cancel. That's going to leave me with x squared plus 4x equals 77. Now I can complete the square. I'll leave that blank there for me to complete the square. So remember, it's half of b. So b is 4, so half of that is 2. We're going to square that. So plus 2 squared plus 2 squared. So over here, our perfect square binomial will be x plus 2 squared equals 77 plus 4. So we end up with x plus 2 squared equals 81. And remember, it's take a square root at this point. So we're going to take a square root. So we got x plus 2 equals positive or negative 9. Then we're going to subtract 2 from each side. And that's going to give me x equals negative 2 plus or minus 9. So we got two different answers here. We got either negative 2 plus 9, or we've got negative 2 minus 9. So our two answers here will either be 7 or negative 11. And there you go. Again, that's the process. All right, so let's take a look at another example. Got to go through all those steps again. So we're going to isolate ax squared plus bx. So we're going to subtract 43 from each side. That's going to leave me with x squared minus 12x equals negative 43. And again, remember, it's half of b, so 12 divided by 2, and that's going to equal 6. And remember, we're going to square it, add it to both sides. So plus 6 squared plus 6 squared. So over here on the left, we're going to end up with x, this time minus 6. The minus comes from that sign. And that's squared. On the other side, we got negative 43 plus 36. So x minus 6 squared. And over here, we've got negative 7. Now at this point, we've got a negative value. So that means in this particular example, we're going to end up with a imaginary answer, a complex solution. So we got x minus 6 equals positive or negative I times the square root of 7. Remember, I is the square root of negative 1. That comes out anytime you have a negative value in the radical. And so now we're going to add 6 to each side. And so that's going to give me x equals 6 plus or minus I times the square root of 7. Done deal. And let's take a look at one more example. Remember, if I'm going too fast, just take a step back and watch me go each step at a time. Write it down on a piece of paper. That way you can kind of copy what I've done. So again, process, get ax squared, or excuse me, x squared plus bx isolated. So we're going to subtract 22 here. That's leaving me x squared plus 8x equals negative 22. Next step is half of b. B is 8. Half of that is 4. And remember, we're going to square that and add it to each side. You'll notice every time I've added it to each side because we're adding a square. All right, on the left, we're going to have x plus 4, quantity squared. And over here, we've got negative 22 plus 16. Looks like we're going to have another complex imaginary solution. So we've got x plus 4 squared equals negative 6. We're going to take the square root of each side. That's giving me x plus 4 equals plus or minus I times the square root of 6. Please make sure you understand that if you have a negative in there, it does simplify. Please do not put no real solutions. I know it's not a real solution. You got to figure out the complex solution. Subtracting 4 from each side to finish this one up will give me x equals negative 4 plus or minus I times the square root of 6. So that's the process for completing the square. And this includes the complex solutions like I've showed you in these last two examples. If you're still struggling with the concept or you need additional help, please send me a teacher message or ask a question or set up an appointment for a help session.